Sit back for a moment and think about who you would choose as the most influential women of the 20th century. Those women who made a difference, not just in America, but in the world. Women who have set the standard for today's women and changed our career path. Questions our guest Susan Ware must have had as she began what she called her casting call for the women in her book, Letter to the World, 7 Women Who Shaped the American Century.
Well, I think in some ways the book started out with another character, and that character was Amelia Earhart. And I got so interested in her that she ended up getting her own book. So I did that book first, and then I thought, well, you know, Amelia Earhart isn't the only one in that period of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, these larger-than-life women. Who else is like an Amelia Earhart? So I really basically started keeping a list, or as I say in my book, it's almost like I had a casting call to think which women were similar in terms of their public presence, their popularity, and their importance for women's history. And I very quickly settled on the 7 that I chose. And of course, they were also ones that I, as a historian, was interested in and wanted to spend time with. And I also thought that my audience would be interested in them as well. And there really is a way in which each of my women, you can spend a little bit of time with her in a chapter and meet her, and then you can move on to someone else. And that was the deliberate structure. And I thought, well, what fun to be able to introduce 7 amazing women in the context of one book.
What is the significance of the title, Letter to the World?
Well, Letter to the World originally it's an Emily Dickinson poem. It is also a Martha Graham dance. So much of what the book is about is the public personas of these women and their importance in popular culture and what they, by extension, meant to their audience. And the phrase letter to the world just seemed to sum that up so well, that their lives were their letters to the world. And now we, modern audiences who didn't necessarily grow up with them or know them, can read those letters.
Eleanor Roosevelt was your first choice, who you portray as the most significant woman in all of 20th century America.
Not just me. There's pretty much agreement about
And
that.
I agree with that. And I think most people would. I think we see her as probably the most inspirational woman of all. So tell us a little bit about that selection.
Well, I felt that she was so important in terms of setting a standard for what women could do in public life, both as the wife of the president and as an independent person and actor on her own. And she also seemed to have such an interesting personal trajectory where she starts in a very traditional marriage and with low expectations for her as a woman. She could have just been a wife and mother. And she just explodes those categories and kind of runs with it and makes her way and then makes such a difference to the world, not just to the United States, but to the world in the 20th century. And so she seemed the place to start.
Why syndicated columnist Dorothy Thompson?
Well, I was to follow Eleanor Roosevelt and also to recapture someone. I think Dorothy Thompson is, of my 7 women, the one that is the least well known now, although sometimes I wonder how well any of these women are known, but
we'll talk about that.
That's another story. But she was, in the 1930s, a significant figure in terms of journalism and also the recognition of events abroad in Europe that were very quickly going to draw the United States into war. And she's someone that people read every day. I mean, there was just, everybody knew who Dorothy Thompson was. And so I think, again, to capture the way in which women were playing roles that they hadn't played before, her as a journalist and then as a syndicated columnist who's really affecting the discourse about peace and war in the 1930s and 40s, that I really wanted to give her a place. And yet I was somewhat interested in trying to figure out, well, why hasn't she had the staying power that someone like Eleanor Roosevelt did?
You label her to be a one-woman crusade against Hitler, and I think so many people didn't realize that as a part of our history.
Yeah, and it was a very important, she was saying things that needed to be said.
That's right. Thirdly, Margaret Mead. So tell us about this selection.
Well, Margaret Mead is such a fascinating character in so many ways. You think of her at age, I think it's 27 when she publishes her first book, and she becomes a media sensation. And then she goes on to write, to be both an anthropologist but also a popularizer. And she had a presence in popular culture from her perch at the Natural History Museum in New York. And what's interesting to me is that she talked a lot about women's issues and gender. And so I was able to use her to talk about, see what people are saying about these issues from the 20s really through the 70s.
Katharine Hepburn, who you write is headstrong, who's used to getting her own way, and you felt you needed to include Hollywood. So my question is, of all the choices in Hollywood, why Katharine Hepburn?
I have always been fascinated with Katharine Hepburn. And I think in this case, it was a chance for me to write a chapter about her, because if I didn't write a chapter about her, I was likely to write a book about her. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to do that. But I also think that of all the actresses, that she especially embodies this sense of independence and being sure of herself and just full speed ahead all the time. Plus she's drop dead gorgeous. She wears pants.
Yeah.
And I've always loved her movies. The movies from the 30s, especially the black and white movies, less so the later ones. But she also had such a staying power in popular culture. And people, I think, really loved the idea of there being a Katharine Hepburn. And I think at the end of her life, she was almost Katharine Hepburn playing the part of Katharine Hepburn. But she was always my choice for Hollywood.
Next, the gifted athlete, Babe. Tell us about Babe.
Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, I think probably the most gifted athlete, male or female, of the 20th century. She could do anything, any sport, and she could beat the boys and the men. She was just amazing. And sports is such an important part of 20th century popular culture, and yet it's been very hard for women to sort of break into that, to become the superstars. Most of the sports stars we think of are men. If you think of Babe Ruth or Joe DiMaggio or Knute Rockne or whatever.
Sure.
And so I thought, well, I've got this amazing woman who starts as a track and field star in the 30s and then becomes a world-renowned golfer in the 40s and 50s before she succumbs to colon cancer at a young age in her 40s. And so for me, it was a chance to write about sports because, of course, if you think back to Katharine Hepburn and her athletic body, and like so many of the actresses in Hollywood, something that's very distinctive about 20th century women is their bodies and the way they embrace athletics. And so I thought, if I'm writing about women's history, I really need to think about sports.
Martha Graham, who danced and dressed to be noticed. Why a dancer?
Because modern dance is so central to the 20th century, and you can't write about modern dance without including Martha Graham. And here she is, she's breaking away from ballet, and she is constructing a mode of dance from a woman's point of view, using a woman's body. She did have men in her troupe, but there's something very woman-centric about what she's doing. And again, this notion of the physicality of women's lives. You know, as a historian, I keep contrasting it to the 19th century when women were encased in corsets and long dresses and couldn't move. And then here in the 20th century, you have Martha Graham in those wonderful stretchy fabric costumes that she would dance in, just showing what a woman's body could do in dance that no one had ever shown before.
And your final selection is Marian Anderson, who is your only African-American woman that was selected for the book. Tell us about this selection.
Well, I certainly was hoping to be able to include not just white women. And yet, since my theme was women who were well known in popular culture, I came up against the racism of the times, which put up much bigger hurdles to an African American becoming a well-known popular
clearly,
star or
yes.
celebrity than a woman.
Yes.
And of course, she had both strikes against her. And yet, she just persevered. She had a gift. Her voice was just, it's just wonderful to listen to. And she really knew what she wanted to do in terms of showing what women and African Americans could do in the field of opera and music. And so for me, it was a story about taking a stand and but doing it in a quiet, private way, not out on the barricades with the civil rights, but in some ways making a similar statement. And I really thought that she belonged in this group.
How did these women portray new images of female achievement and celebrity status?
Well, I think the newness of them and their importance for women's history is that they are all functioning and thriving in fields that 50 or 100 years before would have been closed to women. So you have Eleanor Roosevelt becoming an ambassador to the United Nations, or you have women actresses in Hollywood, or syndicated, newspaper columnists, or opera singers. And these are all new roles that women are taking on. And so I really wanted to be able to show the sweep of the new opportunities for women, because of course that is one of the main themes of 20th century women's history.
How would they wish to be remembered in history?
I think there you go to each individual field, and certainly Martha Graham is so central to modern dance, and Marian Anderson in terms of classical music. So they would see that as their field and really want to be able to be recognized alongside comparable women and also the comparable men. Again, it's when we think of whatever field it is, we want to make sure that our vision includes women as well as men. And that's why we need women's history, because unfortunately, without writing these women into history, like the history of journalism, then we lose Dorothy Thompson.